And we continue at 1:06 in the afternoon. Talk Radio 790 KABC, The John Phillips Show. Mr. Randy Wangs in Culver City.
Bev writes in at johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com and says, "Hey, John and Randy, in 1979, my sister and I moved to San Diego County. When driving down the 5 one day, we saw a bumper sticker that said, 'California is full of fruits and nuts.' Today, after listening to Newsom, I want to update that slogan to, 'California is full of fruits and nuts and corrupt politicians.' Love your show from San Diego."
You'd need a big bumper sticker for that one. 800-222-5222 is the telephone number, 1-800-222-5222. It is our pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. He is a former member of the California State Assembly representing Orange County. He is now the Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You can get him online at texaspolicy.com and follow him on X at Chuck Devore. Assemblyman Chuck Devore, welcome.
Hey, great to be with you again.
So the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, is flying to the state of California today to meet with fire victims and survey the damage. He wants to see with his own two eyes just exactly how much damage was done to Los Angeles County. And he is also prepared to offer money to the people of California, provided there are strings attached, including reshaping our water policy that starves Southern California, and also requiring voter ID for elections in California. You look at the disaster that is these fires. You look at the failure of government. Today, the Los Angeles Times has a piece out, and I mentioned the Los Angeles Times because, of all places, this is the last place you would expect this headline. Here's what the LA Times wrote today. Officials were warned of failing water system before Palisades fire. Fixes never happened. Then you go to the letters that were issued before the fire started from the fire department to the mayor saying, because of these budget cuts, we may not be able to adequately respond to a massive fire. That turned out to be true. And then the person who was responsible at City Hall for dealing with the fire department was on administrative leave for allegedly making false bomb threats. And then these same officials are outraged and offended that the feds just won't give them a blank check so they can continue to spend the money on the same stupidity that got us into this mess. I hope Trump digs in his heels and tells them there's strings or no money.
Well, yes, and what's interesting is if you listen to President Trump's, and it feels so much of a relief to say that now, President Trump, if you listen to President Trump discuss what was happening out in North Carolina, and specifically with FEMA's failures, he was strongly suggesting that it's time for the states to get back to having the prime mission in disaster recovery, with the federal government playing a supporting role, mainly by cutting some checks. And so similarly then with California, what you find is something that we call moral hazard. This is what happens when you separate the risk or the consequences of something from the people who are making the decisions that cause the higher risk. And so what ends up happening when the taxpayers all over the country shovel money into California, which continues to refuse to take basic steps to reduce the fuel load, reduce the threat of wildfires, then you know that all it's going to happen is it's going to happen again and again and again. And John, if you look at the history, you don't have to go back in the newspapers very far to see that these sorts of occurrences have been happening in Southern California since there were decent-sized cities. I mean, even back to the 1820s, which I noted in one of my articles, where you had William Henry Dana write 2 years before the mass. He talks about this massive fire that occurred in Los Angeles. It was so bad that the Angelinos had to live on the beach for 3 days around 1825.
We just played some sound of California Governor Gavin Newsom responding to what President Trump had been saying. And it's hard to decipher what the point he's trying to convey, because Gavin Newsom speaks in ways that normal human beings don't speak in. But if I followed him correctly, basically what he's saying is there shouldn't be strings attached to the money because the reservoir that was out of water in the Pacific Palisades was not a state reservoir, so he wasn't responsible for it. His reservoirs have water, so don't blame him and don't punish him.
Well, again, this has to do with a governor providing the sort of leadership and direction that you would expect a governor to provide. The city of Los Angeles exists at the sufferance of the state. It is a political unit of the state of California. And yes, we can't help it that Mayor Bass, someone, by the way, whom I served with in the state assembly and who was the speaker of the assembly for a while, and went on to Congress. And oh, by the way, I can't remember in her resume, in her career, her having managed anything larger than a small community, activist organization. But here she is, the mayor of one of America's largest cities, and I think terribly mismanaging it. So shame on the voters of Los Angeles for voting her in. But the end of the bottom line is that yes, the governor has a degree of responsibility and culpability. If they were focusing on important things rather than trying to be everything to everybody, at least everybody on the left, these sorts of problems would have been taken care of, including expediting the permits that were needed to do the prescribed burns to reduce the fuel load, something that I've been writing about for well more than a decade, warning about what California was doing and how it was leading to a lack of fire insurance and making housing more scarce out in the fringes of the major cities where, that abut the forests or the brush. This is a problem that's been long forecast and easily seen from miles and miles away.
One of the allegations that Newsom has made against Trump is that Trump is playing politics with this money. But you go back to before Donald Trump ever took office. This is pre-January 20th. Gavin Newsom called for a special session of the state legislature so he could provide tens of millions of dollars to the California Department of Justice and other entities to, quote-unquote, Trump-proof the state. This is before Donald Trump took any actions as president of the United States, and they were politically already posturing themselves to fight him tooth and nail on everything.
Well, right, as opposed to, maybe fireproofing the state of California. Wouldn't that have been nice? Again, this is what we expect. Gavin Newsom is termed out. He desperately wants to be president of the United States, so he's already eyeing the fact that Trump can't run again, so it's going to be probably running against either J.D. Vance or maybe someone else, and he needs to capture the Democratic nomination. And to do that, you've got to be aligned with the far-left progressive element of the Democratic Party that controls things right now. And so, you do that by doing performative things against President Trump to show the world what a great warrior you are while your state burns down.
Coming up later on in the hour, we're going to speak with Owen Brennan, who recently commissioned a poll on L.A. Mayor Karen Bass. That poll, Assemblyman, found that 54% of Los Angeles residents disapprove of her job performance. Only 37% approve. In a head-to-head matchup against Rick Caruso, if the election were held today, Rick Caruso would beat Karen Bass by 7 points, and Karen Bass only polls at 36%. Do you think she's going to survive this?
Yeah, so, recalls are kind of tough in California. You have to look at, okay, when is the next election? Is she just going to fade away and allow someone else to run? If by survive you mean survive to the end of her term, probably. If you mean survive as in get reelected, that's going to be, I think, a much more difficult proposition. Plus, Karen Bass is no spring chicken either. So I think that she may just be a one-term mayor.
And for her, that would be a massive disappointment because I'm sure she planned on ending her career as a two-term mayor of Los Angeles. We know that she was on the short list to be Joe Biden's vice presidential nominee, and she got kneecapped by Kamala Harris in her political operation here in California who put out all the stories about her love for Fidel Castro and other problematic statements that she's made before in the past. Like Grampy Joe, this is not going to be the way she wanted to end her political career, I'm sure.
Well, right. And if you had just maybe put a little more emphasis on basic governance, you wouldn't have had this problem. But again, this goes back to a fundamental challenge that the left has with government. They view government with such an expansive vision that you end up with government that tries to do everything and doesn't do anything very well. And I think that's what you see in Los Angeles, where you had these very difficult budgetary decisions. And they're like, well, the fire department's kind of large. Let's cut them back a few percent and yield some more money for, I don't know, maybe diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
In previous years, when Paradise, California got burned down and PG&E was held responsible for that, it was their faulty equipment that they knew about and they chose not to fix because it would be cheaper for them to just make an insurance payout if a large fire were to happen, assuming that the state would bail them out, which is in fact what ended up happening. But they were taken to court by the local district attorney, and they were found criminally liable for starting that fire. When you look at this fire specifically in Pacific Palisades, and you go through what we talked about, the cutting of the budget for the fire department, the administrator that was supposed to be the liaison between the mayor and the fire department being on administrative leave for allegedly making bomb threats, being warned about the failing water system before the fire and failing to fix it. If this was a private entity, would they be looking at criminal liability?
Well, if it was a private entity, yes, but governments only get to be sued that way if governments allow it. They have to give permission to be sued that way. And even going back to PG&E, though, let's have the rest of the story, right? PG&E asked the California Public Utilities Commission for an extra, $2.5–3 billion to upgrade their power lines. And they were turned down by the PUC because the PUC and the politicians who put the PUC in place were worried about the fact that Californians are paying now the second highest electrical rates in the country behind Hawaii because of all of the wind and solar power and batteries that cost so much money for consumers to have reliable electricity. And so they said, no, PG&E, we're not going to allow you to have an additional couple $2 billion that you're going to pass on to consumers to upgrade your power lines because the consumers might get a little angry about how expensive their electricity is getting.
We had James Gallagher, the Assembly Republican leader, on the program a few days ago. He said it doesn't matter what the state is saying right now. The FAIR Plan, the insurance policy of last resort for people who live in high fire risk areas like Malibu and the Pacific Palisades, and if you go inland, places like Lake Arrowhead and Big Bear. He said that that plan is bankrupt, even though they haven't officially declared bankruptcy yet. Ricardo Lara, the elected insurance commissioner, recently had a very rare press conference. He's been basically in hiding for his entire 2 terms as insurance commissioner, but he came out of hiding and said that the FAIR Plan would survive this. The FAIR Plan would be solvent, and they would be able to pay out on claims. Do you believe that the FAIR Plan will be fine after all of this, or do you think, as James Gallagher does, that it's bankrupt and it either goes belly up or it will require some kind of bailout?
Well, it's going to require some sort of bailout, and what is likely going to happen is that the environmental left is going to put conditions on who gets insurance. And again, I've been writing about this and warning about it for years. The environmentalists do not like people living in the lower cost areas that are either adjacent to national forests or U.S. Forest Service land or the coastal scrub, the chaparral and the Southland. They want people living in boxes and high-density, high-rise apartments in the dense urban areas. That's what they want. And so for them, a lack of fire insurance is not a bug, it's a feature. And that's how they can control and cut back on some of what they would call sprawl out in the wildland-urban interface. It's going to need a bailout, and it's going to be the taxpayers that are going to bail it out. And what's going to probably happen is that there's going to be further restrictions on who ends up getting this valuable fire insurance, because, of course, the banks aren't going to loan you money for a mortgage unless you have hazard insurance for your home.
My homeowner's insurance policy is through State Farm. State Farm, along with Allstate, has announced that they are no longer selling new policies in the state of California, which is kind of deceptive because it means that they won't sell you policies on new properties, newly purchased properties. You can be an existing State Farm or Allstate customer, and if you were to acquire another property, you couldn't add it or bundle it in to your existing policy. You would have to go to a different company and buy homeowners insurance through somebody else. Given the fact that these companies are pulling out of the state as quickly as they can, and every time I get a renewal notice in the mail from State Farm, I'm kind of surprised. I just assume that they're going to drop me at some point. What do you think the insurance scene is going to look like in California in the not-so-distant future?
It's going to become increasingly monopolized by the government. This always happens when the government moves into the space, is that always ends up pushing out private operators with high-cost, inefficient, crappy insurance run by central government. This is inevitable. And by the way, this is something that happens throughout human history with the evolution of governments. The only reason why America has been largely able to escape it at a macro level is because of the unique nature of our constitutional republic. We have the ability to renew ourselves from time to time. Exhibit A would be the reelection of Donald Trump to this most improbable non-consecutive 2 terms.
If a member of the legislature or the insurance commissioner or anyone, the governor in elected office in California, were to come to you and say, okay, we're trying to write the insurance game here in California, what's the first thing we should do? What advice would you give them?
The first thing that needs to be done, and I think Darrell Issa is trying to do this at the federal level, is you need to cut through the thicket of regulation that prevents you as a homeowner or as a manager of public lands, prevents you from doing the things that need to be done to reduce the fuel load. In the Southland, that means prescribed burns. In the north, that means prescribed burns and more timber harvesting permits, where after harvesting the timber companies are responsible for clearing up the underbrush and reducing the fuel load through burning and things like that. It's gotten so bad now, John, that up in Northern California, there was an interesting report a couple of years ago that the publicly owned forests in California are now net emitters of carbon dioxide because of how poorly managed they are and how much they burn. You have to really mess things up pretty bad to have a forest actually be a net emitter of carbon dioxide. But that's where we are here in California.
Darrell Issa is working on this at the federal level. Is there anyone in California government that you can tell is working on it at the state level that could push us in the right direction?
Well, you're seeing Band-Aid fixes, right? You saw Gavin Newsom talk about like holding back on the California Environmental Quality Act, just so that people in the Pacific Palisades and a few of the other fire-impacted areas could rebuild. So you see this great reluctance to tear down the edifice that's been built up over the last 60 years. We'll give you, your favored people, you're deep blue, you give us a lot of money, we'll let you rebuild. By the way, this is so rarely granted. You may recall that the first time that there was such a huge exemption provided was after the earthquake up in the Bay Area that damaged the baseball stadium. And they pushed through the legislature a exemption that exempted the city and county of San Francisco from the Environmental Quality Act to be able to rebuild the stadium in record time. So, look, there is way too much fealty pledged to these rules and to the environmental movement for them to just cut it all down and metaphorically burn it away. So I think that you're only going to see temporary patches that will be just enough to allow some people to rebuild, but not enough to systemically fix the problem, which is that you have to get out there and burn, even if the environmentalists sue you over some little plant or critter, or the air quality management district says, oh, you can't do it because people have more, incidence of asthma if you do that. It's just too hard to do the right thing in California, and that's why it doesn't get done, and we keep having these devastating wildfires.
Assemblyman Chuck Devore. You can get him online at texaspolicy.com and follow him on X at Chuck Devore. Assemblyman Chuck Devore, thank you so much for stopping by today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
If you'd like to email the show, you can do so at johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com. That's johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com. And Randy, now that we've hit the halfway point of today's show, if you want to continue listening to us after we sign off at 3, that's easy to do.
All you got to do is go to KABC.com, click on podcasts, go to the Apple Podcast app, iHeart, Spotify, search for The John Phillips Show, hit subscribe. You can download all the episodes. You can do a Google on the YouTube or get that handy-dandy KABC app. Search KABC AM in the Apple App Store or the Android Store. It's the easiest way to listen live to this radio station wherever you are, and we love getting these emails about all the people listening from out of town. So keep sending those. Tell us where you found us, how you found us, and why you listen, and download all the podcasts. You can listen to them in Southern California. You can listen to them in Oakland. You can listen to them in Vallejo.
Our target was set on fire.
And speaking of Vallejo, if you're listening to us up there, we're moving down the dial.
AM 810 is the new home for KSFO. It's where we do the Fix California Hour, weeknights at 11 p.m. Sometimes it's also on at 6 p.m. So give it a listen. Check it out. It's the Fix California Hour in the Bay Area, and you can hear it down here at night because that signal is real strong.
It is our pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. He is a writer, producer, and founder and president of Madison McQueen. You can get him online at madisonmcqueen.com and follow on X at Owen Brennan. Owen Brennan, welcome.
Hey there. Thanks for having me. Happy Jimmy Buffett Friday.
Well, happy Jimmy Buffett Friday to you. Hope you have a Mai Tai nearby. So your firm commissioned a poll about where Los Angeles stands in regard to embattled Mayor Karen Bass, and you found some shocking results.
Yeah, John, Los Angeles County saw a move in 2024 for President Trump. He had 44,000 more people vote for him in 2024 in LA County than in 2020. So we had a feeling there's some movement in this county. And we thought that the response to the wildfires was such a disaster that we should see, really, does the future bode well for Republicans in LA County? And specifically, what does it look like for our Democrat elected leadership? It doesn't bode very well, especially for Karen Bass, who had a disapproval rating in our poll of 54%. There's an approval rating of 37%, which means that 37% of our county is either relatives, paid staff, or lunatics.
If you're an incumbent and you're at 37%, that's a danger zone.
It is a danger zone. We also found the good news. So we did a head-to-head poll with Caruso and Mayor Bass, and if that election were held today, Rick Caruso would win by 7 points. Which is a great sign for a change in leadership, because Rick Caruso really has a different vision for our city. I don't know if you saw him on Bill Maher. I'm sure you saw him right after the disasters. That's the kind of guy that is the electable next mayor of Los Angeles. And you got some growing support for different direction and different leadership as well. We talked to our pollsters talked to people, and we found that 43% of the people we talked to would consider voting for Republicans. Now, why is that significant? Significant because we have about 20% registration rate in the state, so that was the city, which means twice as many people that are registered Republicans are considering voting for Republicans. So there is certainly an avenue for Republicans in the future. And statewide, that also means if we can close the margin in Los Angeles, that bodes well for Republicans statewide as well.
I'm looking at these numbers, the head-to-head matchup between Karen Bass and Rick Caruso. And Caruso, you have at 43%. You have Bass at 36%. And here's another flag for Karen Bass. You have the undecided number at 21%. And Dick Morris, the former Clinton advisor, always says that a large undecided percentage is bad news for an incumbent, because it's like being a marriage counselor where you have a couple that's sitting on the couch in front of you and you say, do you think that you'll be married a year from now? The answer is yes, then fine, the couple's doing okay. If the answer is no, that's bad news. They're headed to Splitsville. And if the answer is I don't know, that means the answer is no.
I think that's correct analysis. And I think that the undecided voters, either they don't want to admit to what they believe is true. And so if you had even 10 points out of that 21, that puts Caruso at 53, which would be a significant pummeling of our current mayor.
Well, and there's also this curveball, because it's not just Rick Caruso who's making noises about running for mayor next time around. Kenneth Mejia, who is the citywide elected controller in Los Angeles, very left-wing. He's part of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. He is also posturing himself very aggressively against Karen Bass. If she were to run for re-election and have incoming fire coming from the right from Rick Caruso and incoming fire from the left from Kenneth Mejia, you could come up with a scenario where she doesn't even make it out of the primary.
Absolutely. I think that she is not going to get better in the job over the next 2 years. We're just going to see this person who's a poor communicator, who is not prepared for this job, doing a bad job for the next 2 years. So this is her ceiling at 36%, right? She's only going to go down from there.
And you think of what else is out there. Well, we know how much damage was done in the Palisades. We know how much damage was done in Altadena, albeit Altadena is not in the city limits of the city of Los Angeles, so we can't pin that one on her. But we do not yet know the origins of these fires. They have not determined how these fires started. And it seems to me like the best case scenario for her is if Southern California Edison is found to be responsible, because she doesn't regulate Edison. Other governmental agencies do. Certainly, it then wouldn't be a homeless encampment that she was supposed to bust up that started it. It wouldn't be a serial arsonist who was supposed to be in jail and wasn't. It wouldn't be a criminal who was out doing something they shouldn't be doing, and they probably should have been in jail. Any of those other scenarios, it's going to reflect extremely poorly on her and potentially other elected officials. I think they have every motivation possible to pin these fires on Edison.
Oh, absolutely. It would be a disaster if it was an illegal alien who was an arsonist out on parole for Karen Bass.
And I don't know what you say about that if you're her, because what policies led to a person like that being able to do something like this? And the answer is basically all of the policies that she has supported her entire career. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that they're not going to play it straight, because you'll probably have multiple agencies investigating this. But I do know that if there's any way, shape, or form they can pin it on Edison, that's what they're going to do.
True. But I think she also has another problem. She has a problem with people just not showing up, right? Kamala Harris, 1.8 million voters in California didn't show up for her. She took the state. She won the state. But there's not a lot of enthusiasm around Kamala. There's not a lot of enthusiasm around Mayor Bass. So she could have the bottom fall out of her just because people don't really care or connect with her.
And it's also dangerous for her because when she's on the ballot, it used to be that the mayor of Los Angeles was on the ballot in odd years, and then they changed it to even years. So she's going to be on the same ballot as members of Congress, as everyone running for governor and all the statewide constitutional offices, which means they're going to get asked about her, and they're going to get asked about her performance. And that was one of the problems that George Gascon faced when he ran for re-election last time around. No one would defend him. No one outside of the DSA members of the city council and a few outliers the bold-faced names that got behind him before, the Gavin Newsoms and the Adam Schiffs and the Laura Friedmans. Laura Friedman did back him for re-election, but the other two just essentially tried to stay away from him like he had cancer that was contagious. If you're Karen Bass, running with everyone else gives them the motivation to provide you no cover because they don't want to be blamed for it. And if Karen Bass is the one who the public is blaming, if you're another Democrat running for another office, you are benefited from the fact that everyone's blaming her.
Well, to quote your favorite mayor of in the Bay Area, absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, she is. She could be the scapegoat for everybody, right? Like, oh, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not like her, right? That disaster, no, that's not what I want to be. So, yes, she's in a very difficult position right now.
One of the emails that we've been getting quite a bit of recently are emails from people who say we should recall her from office. We should kick her out before her term expires. I am not hot on that. I don't know if you guys pulled that scenario. I'm not hot on it, though, because I do not want the LA City Council to replace her. Because if they do, they're not going to replace her with Rick Caruso. They're going to replace her with someone who's probably worse than Karen Bass. So I think we're better off just waiting until the next election and getting her that way.
I couldn't agree more. And the way Susan Shelley had a great piece about why we shouldn't recall Mayor Bass, because the laws have been changed up in Sacramento to make it very difficult. It quintupled the number of signatures required, like 330,000 or so. The 50 supporters have to sign their names and their addresses to the intent to recall the mayor, and it also opens them up to libel and slander being sued. So I mean, can imagine the teachers union would have a field day suing 50 people who want to try to recall Mayor Bass. And you're absolutely right. The worst thing of it all is that the city council just picks the replacement, and it would be an absolute disaster. We had some polling on that, and countywide, she was at 45%. People said that they wanted to see her either resign or be recalled. And obviously, this wasn't an informed ballot, letting people know that the city council would be replacing her. But Newsom inexplicably had more than 54%, approved of his performance out there post wildfires.
Was there any glimmer of hope or good news for Karen Bass in this poll?
So not really. There seems to be, people didn't really care as much. I think folks on the right saw her trip to Africa as being like a really light her up. This is insane. The numbers didn't really show that. There's like 60% of the respondents came back and said, it's not such a big deal. So she can go back to Africa, and most of LA is not going to give her a hard time for doing that. We also looked at some of the DEI hires for the fire department. There wasn't a lot of anger around that. So her overall performance at the end of the day was significantly disapproved of.
Owen Brennan from Madison McQueen, they are the firm that commissioned this poll showing LA Mayor Karen Bass at a 37% approval rating, a 54% disapproval rating, and if a head-to-head matchup were to happen today, Rick Caruso would beat her by 7 points, 43-36. You can follow Owen on X at Owen Brennan. Owen, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks, John.
If you'd like to email the show, you can do so at johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com. That's johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com. And Randy, you're monitoring the mailbag.
We love getting these emails about how you discovered the show, where you discovered the show, and why you listen. Mike writes in at johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com and says, I found your radio show while searching for a program that didn't announce the time and temperature every 30 seconds. You guys are second only to the great Leon Kaplan, the Motorman, when it comes to radio that is listenable.
We love the Motorman.
And L.A. loves the Motorman. That man is popular when he's walking around Encino.
And Burbank, too, because of Jay Leno.
Oh, yeah.
We have one more hour to go before we hit the weekend. Rick Caruso, the billionaire developer in Los Angeles who unsuccessfully challenged Karen Bass for mayor last time around, is back with a vengeance. He did a sit-down on KTLA and pulled no punches. That sound up next. This is the John Phillips Show on Talk Radio 790 KABC.